Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to AJ 112 Introduction to Criminology. My name is Tony Farrar, and I will be your instructor for this semester. And tonight's lecture is going to cover Chapter 1, where we are going to talk about crime and criminology. And basically, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of different things. First, we're going to look at some of the elements of criminology. And what I mean by that is, what do criminologists actually do? So we're not going to go down every single thing, but we're going to look at those big major things that explain some of the things that criminologists actually do. We're going to differentiate between crime and deviance. So we're going to see how those two things are different. Are all deviant acts crimes? And so that's something for us to think about. We're going to analyze three different views of the definition of a crime, and ask yourself right now before we get started, what is a crime, and how is that defined, and do people view it differently? Well, criminologists actually have their own definition of crime, and we're going to take a look at that. We're also going to look at the reasons or the purposes of criminal law. Why do we have it, and should we have it? We're going to take a brief look at the criminal justice process and see how that ties into tonight's lecture. And then we're going to kind of finish summarizing some of the ethical issues in criminology, basically three very, very important ones. So we'll start off every lecture, and you'll see that as we go further through the semester, with a cool little thing I call fact or fiction to get your brain thinking. And what this is I may cover this and you may get the answer in the lecture or you may not, but at the very least, it's going to get you thinking about what this chapter material is about. So again, remember, we're going to be talking about what criminologists do, etc. So let's start off. Fact or fiction: sex offender registration lists help deter potential offenders and reduce the number of, let's say, child molestation cases. Fact or fiction: is it a crime to ignore a drowning person's cries for help? And then finally, fact or fiction: the definitions of some long established crimes that have developed or evolved all the way from common law until current statutory law right now. Things like rape, robbery, and murder, they never change. So think about that. Do crimes change? Or the definition, let's say, of crimes, do they change? So think about those things as we start to kind of walk through the chapter. We'll start off with a very brief case study that's going to kind of lead us into the introduction of our Chapter 1 crime and criminology topic. So on December 2nd, 2015, Syed Rizwan Farook and Tashfeen Malik, residents of Redlands, California, attacked a holiday party being held for employees at the San Bernardino County Department of Public Health. Armed with semi-automatic weapons, they ended up killing 14 people and seriously injuring about 22 others. Now, Farook worked for the health department. He was an American-born citizen of Pakistani descent, while his wife, Malik, was a Pakistani-born individual, but a lawful permanent resident. They both had a 6-month daughter together. And after the shooting, the couple fled the scene in a rented SUV and were later killed in a shootout with pursuing police. Now, both of these individuals, Farook and Malik, are considered homegrown violent extremists, inspired by, but not directed by, a foreign group. And a lot of their inspiration, if you will, came from the internet, or their radicalization was believed to have been via the internet. Now, on April 15th in 2013, Djakar and Tamirian Tarznevev set off bombs at the Boston Marathon finish line, killing 3 people and maiming and injuring about 264 others. Now, these two brothers, though born abroad of Chechen descent, had really prospered in the United States, one of them attending a state university. Nonetheless, though, the brothers clung to some radical Islamic views and basically blamed the U.S. government for conducting a war against Islam in Afghanistan and Iraq. And finally, on November 28th, 2016, Somali refugee Abul Razak Ali Artan deliberately drove his car into pedestrians at Ohio State University. And after that, he got out of the car and attacked others with a butcher knife before being shot and killed by first responding police officers. And in this particular incident, 13 people were injured in the attack, and investigators believe that Artan was inspired by terrorist propaganda from the Islamic State and radical Muslim cleric Anwar Ali Awlaki. Now, with that being said, these particular incidents, these high-profile incidents, have spurred on an ongoing national debate over the response to terrorism. These widely publicized criminal acts, including terrorist attacks like we just talked about, have also stimulated interest in criminology, because you have to think about it. What motivates people like Farouk and Malik to turn on their coworkers? And what was their real motive? Was their crime a matter of rational choice and decision making? Or was it more the outcome of some type of delusional thinking, or perhaps maybe some type of mental illness? And unlike political figures and media commentators whose opinions about crime may be kind of distorted by personal experiences and bias and etc., criminologists, though, they remain objective as they study crime and its consequences. So this is a far-reaching field, and the subject matter can range from something as simple as a drug dealer to organized crime, from a lone wolf terrorist, meaning someone that acts by themselves, or international terrorism, or to the control of, let's say, child pornography. So as we get into the chapter, we're going to review and take a look at the components of this diverse field of study, and how this field developed, and how criminologists view crime and justice. But we're going to start off by taking a look at and focusing on some of the concerns of the academic discipline itself. Now, the worldview of criminology kind of looks like the pictures that you have. It's movies and TV, it's CSI, it's Criminal Minds, it's Forensic Files, it's Law and Order, it's all those cool programs, and don't get me wrong, they're cool. But that's kind of the world view. But in reality, it is completely something a little bit different. So with that being said, what is it then? What makes up the field of criminology? So criminology is an academic discipline that uses the scientific method to study the nature, extent, cause, and control of criminal behavior. It's the study of crime. It's kind of cool. But it's also an interdisciplinary field involving a lot of other academic disciplines. And I hope that kind of makes sense. And if you look at the picture, you can see the on the left, the social scientific discipline, and on the right is the interdisciplinary component. And if you look down kind of under the table, you can see the things that feed in here, that overlap, whether it's anthropology, philosophy, biology, law, sociology, medicine, political science, physiology, economics, psychiatry, ethics. All of these things kind of feed into this particular discipline. So with that said, there are several sub-areas that exist within the broader arena of criminology. Some criminologists specialize in one one area while really not paying attention to some others. And some are what we call generalists, whose research interests are very wide or very broad. So let's take a look at some of these areas that fit these sub areas, and they'll probably be about 6 or 7. And I'm going to go through them rather quickly, but yeah, stay with me. It'll all be okay. So the first one we're going to look at, the sub area of criminal statistics and crime measurement. Now, this area involves creating methodologies, if you will, that are able to accurately measure activities and trends and patterns in crime, and then using these tools to calculate amounts and developments in criminal activity. You know, so you have to kind of ask, so when you look at these questions, how much crime actually occurs, and who commits it, and when and where does it occur, and which crimes are considered the most serious. And criminologists, this sub area looks at all of that data and information in order to help answer some of those particular questions. And a visual I can kind of give you would be this diagram, if you will, of the teardrop rapist. Now, this is a rapist who has been victimizing women since 1995, and this person has not been identified. And at least 39 associated assaults have occurred. The last one reported in 2013, and LAPD is still looking for this individual. Now, when you do that, when you're talking about criminology, and you're looking at numbers and charts and data and things like that, again, criminal statistics and crime measurement, here's a map, if you will, of all of the incidents that have taken place that you can see right here. I'm kind of arrowing around. And then you can look at the timeline on the right, and you'll see some very interesting things. It starts in 1995, and then you can see that it's pretty solid all the way. You've got a good peak right in here in the 2000s, and then it starts to drop off. You've got nothing here in 04. You've got one in 05, and then this person disappears for many years and then comes back up in 2011. So you could ask yourself the question, well, what happened? Did the person stop committing the crimes after he did all the ones that he did before? Or was he incarcerated? Or did he get older and age out? Well, I mean, he may have been younger here, but then he started up again. So these are interesting criminology questions. And one last thing before we move on to the next area, criminologists interested in computing criminal statistics, they do focus on creating what we call valid and reliable measures. And a valid measure is one that actually measures what it purports to measure, a measure that's factual. And a reliable measure is one that produces consistent results from one measurement to another. But just a couple of definitions for you. So the next area, the sub area that falls inside of this broader area of criminology, is going to be the sociology of law, or known as law and society, or socio-legal studies. So again, variously called sociology of law, law of society, or socio-legal studies. This particular sub area of criminology is concerned with the social, political, and intellectual influence of law and legal activity. The sociology of legal institutions and even the legal process, and consequences of law on society. So criminologists who study the impact of law on society, they focus their attention on the role that social forces might play in shaping criminal law, and the role of criminal law in shaping society. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? And they might investigate the history of legal thought in an effort to understand how criminal acts like theft or rape or murder have evolved into their present form. They may also play an active role in suggesting legal changes that benefit society. So criminologists who are interested in this socio-legal scholarship type thing evaluate the impact that the new laws might have on society. And an example could be, take sex offender registration laws, which require a convicted sex offender to register with local law enforcement agencies whenever they move into a certain community. And that kind of brings us back around to our first fact or fiction. Do sex offender registration lists help deter potential offenders? And the answer is really doesn't. Research has kind of indicated that registration has little effect on either offenders or the rates of these types of crimes that are taking place. So now back to the sociology of law really quick. Remember, I talked about how this area of criminology might influence some cases. So take the example of the Supreme Court ruling in Miller versus Alabama, which basically barred mandatory life sentences for juveniles convicted of murder. Criminologists might be called upon to test public opinion on whether your offenders have the potential for rehabilitation. They may also explore whether adolescent brains have developed sufficiently to fully understand the consequences of behavior. Another case, Miller versus Alabama. The Supreme Court did rely on some social research that did conclusively show that juveniles are not fully capable of understanding and anticipating the consequences of their actions. So that's a couple of examples on how the sociology of law in society, and socio-legal studies can weave its way into this sub area of criminology. So another sub area that falls under the umbrella that we're talking about will be theories of crime causation. So criminologists also explore the cause of crime. How do the mechanisms of past experience influence an individual's propensity to offend, commit crime? Is past behavior the best predictor of future behavior? So that's kind of an interesting thing. Can people even change? Are the seeds of criminal career paths planted early in life, or do life events kind of upend a person's normal life course and change maybe the way that you do things? And I kind of hope that really makes a little bit of sense. Some criminologists focus on the individual and look for an association between decision making, say psychological and biological traits, and even antisocial behaviors. And those who have a psychological orientation view crime as a function of personality development, social learning, or cognition. And others investigate, again, the biological correlations or antisocial behavior and genetic patterns. So there's all these different things that fall underneath this category. So, ask yourself kind of this, are you born a criminal? And the picture that you see in front of you, the left one photograph there is a normal brain, and the right one is considered one of someone who was a murderer. And, are there some differences? Can we really look at something like this and actually see some differences? And here's kind of a larger brain scan, if you will. Again, the one on the left is one from what we would just say for this particular lecture, a normal brain, and the one on the right is one that is not. So again, some criminologists are going to focus on the person and look for an association between decision making and these psychological or biological traits and antisocial behavior, and others may investigate the biological correlators of antisocial behavior and the study of, let's say, biochemical, genetic, and neurological links to crime. Are there some of those neurological things? And those with a sociological orientation look at social forces producing criminal behavior including things like neighborhood conditions or poverty or socialization and even group interaction. And there is a belief, or their belief is, that people are the product of their environment, and anyone living in a, let's say, substandard neighborhood or condition, or being exposed to that, could be at risk to commit crime. But really pinning down one true cause is extremely, extremely difficult. You know, when you look at the picture, can you really be a product of your environment? Just because you grow up in this neighborhood, does that mean that you're going to be a criminal? Or just the exposure, could you be exposed to more things that you might be tempted to become involved in that might lead you astray to later become involved in some type of criminal activity? Next photo, I kind of show you the same thing, a product of your environment, the way you were raised, etc., the people that you hang out with. In this particular picture, a gang member, a skinhead. You know, could this person be a product of their environment? Just to kind of get you thinking. All right, another subsection, okay, or sub area that exists within the broader arena of criminology would be explaining criminal behavior. So another sub area of criminology involves research on specific criminal types and patterns. Violent crime, theft crime, public order crime, organized crime, and so on. Numerous attempts have been made to describe and understand particular crime types. A lot of different attempts. Now, Marvin Wolfgang, in his 1958 study called Patterns in Criminal Homicide, and this is a landmark analysis, this analysis was of the nature of homicide and the relationship between the victim and the offender, trying to understand the criminal behavior part. And Wolfgang, in his research, discovered in many ways victims caused or precipitated the violent confrontation that led to their death, which brought about this term called victim precipitated homicide. And this refers to, kind of by definition, those killings in which the victim is a direct positive precipitator of that particular incident. And Edwin Sutherland, this is another individual, did a pioneering analysis of business-related crimes. And this also, through this research, helped coin the phrase white-collar crime to describe economic crime activities of the affluent. These were illegal acts that capitalized on a person's status in the marketplace, or crimes like theft or embezzlement or fraud or market manipulation or trade fraud or false advertising, etc. So again, this is one of those areas that fall underneath this bigger area, or of criminology. So another sub area that exists within this broader area, and we'll spend a lot more time on this in later chapters, so don't panic, but I'm just trying to kind of cover a lot of information as we go through this. So another sub area would be the study of penology, which would be punishments, sanctions, and corrections. So the study of penology involves efforts to control crime through the correction of criminal offenders. Now, some criminologists advocate a therapeutic approach to crime prevention that relies on the application of what we call rehabilitation. And this is basically treatment that is aimed at preventing future behavior. And others argue that crime can be prevented only through the application of some formal social control. And that's the elements of social control are like the courts and police and corrections, etc. So here others are saying that, you know what, we can only prevent crime through the application of formal social control, something like mandatory sentencing, which is basically a statutory requirement for a certain penalty. You do the crime, you do the time, etc. For serious crimes. And then capital punishment or death as a deterrent for murder. Criminologists interested in penology direct their research efforts in evaluating the effectiveness of control programs like prisons, and searching for effective treatments that can reduce what we call recidivism. This is the relapse of criminal behavior. So the rate of going in and out of prison, in and out, in and out, in and out. And then by definition, just so you know, penology by definition is the correction and control of known criminal offenders. And you know, we talked, I kind of threw that word in there called deterrence. And the reason I put it in there is that part of some of the penalty thoughts, and we'll talk about deterrence a little bit later, is that if we have these penalties that are very harsh, that perhaps people would view the fact that if they got caught and they got punished or convicted, and then it was going to be something like you see before you in one of these photos, that maybe they won't do that. And there's a big debate over the death penalty, and I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I do want to show you a pretty cool little chart. Now it's cool because it's fairly up to date. It does go through 2016. Now, if you look at the red bars, these are states that have the death penalty. And if you look at the kind of the lighter pink bars, if you will, or the light red, those are the states that have non-death penalty. Okay, so they've done a side-by-side comparison overall and by year. So it's actually kind of nice the way that they broke it up for us. And if you look at something interesting, remember some of these harsh penalties are meant to deter people from doing what they're doing. But if you look at the red bars, the rates of murder are higher than those of the non-death penalty states. And if you want more information, you can click on this link and it'll take you there. But I thought I would throw that out there because it really, really is an interesting thought. Again, now's not the time for the debate on the death penalty, but this does give you a little bit of information. There's another chart here that kind of shows you by the numbers exactly, or the percentages on how this goes. So it kind of mirrors up here. So another sub area, and we're getting close to at least finishing with the particular sub areas, and a very, very important one is called victimology. Now, criminologists recognize that the victim plays a critical role in the criminal process, and that the victim's behavior is often a key determinant of crime. And victimology includes a couple of different things. It includes, let's say, using victim surveys to measure the nature and extent of criminal behavior and to calculate the actual costs of crime to victims. Also, calculating probabilities of victimization risk, and studying victim culpability in the precipitation of crime, and then finally designing services for crime victims such as counseling and compensation. So criminologists who study victimization have uncovered some kind of interesting results. For one thing, criminals have been found to be at greater risk of victimization than non-criminals. And this finding then indicates that rather than being passive targets who are in the wrong place at the wrong time, if you will, victims may themselves be engaging in some type of high-risk behavior, such as crime, that increases their level or victimization risk and renders them vulnerable to crime. I hope that kind of, comes across easy to understand. The pictures here kind of show you that, again, I'm not saying that all victims are responsible. What they are saying is that sometimes the places we go, the positions we put ourselves into, etc., can make us more prone to becoming a victim, especially if we're involved in some type of illegal activity as well. So you can kind of look at the different pictures, think about it. Do you ever go to the ATM in the middle of the night by yourself? That's kind of where we're going with this particular thing. So again, criminologists who study this victimization thing have really kind of found a really unique tie-in, if you will, on the fact of how victims can play a role in a lot of the things that happen to them, etc. Here's some photos when we talk about if you're involved in, if you're a gang member, we'll use that as an example. You do have a higher chance of becoming a victim yourself because you are involved in some type of criminal activity. And then there's a little chart that the textbook gives you that I thought I'd throw in there that walks through some of the areas that we talked about. So it makes it a little bit easier. So I said a lot of stuff, but if you look at here, we started off, remember, with like statistics. Well, here's a very small focus or sub area. The sociology of law, here's a small definition. So it kind of walks you through these different areas and makes it a little bit easier to understand. So with that being said, now that we've kind of gone through some of these sub areas, let's move now into a brief history of criminology. So how did this field of study develop, and what are the origins of criminology? The scientific study of crime and criminality is a relatively recent development. Now, during the Middle Ages, let's say 1200 to 1600, people who violated social norms or religious practices were believed to have been witches or possessed by demons. And as such, the use of cruel torture to extract confessions was very, very common, and those convicted of violent or theft crimes suffered very harsh penalties, including things like whipping or branding and maiming and even execution. By the mid-18th century, however, social philosophers began to argue for a more rational approach to punishment. Now, reformers stressed that the relationship between crime and punishment should be more balanced and fair. And the more moderate of criminal sanctions we can trace back to the writings of an Italian scholar, and you'll hear this guy's name a lot, Cesare Basiaria, who was one of the first scholars to develop what we considered to be a systematic understanding of why people commit crime. So this is classical criminology, a theoretical perspective suggesting that people choose to commit crime and that crime can be controlled if potential criminals fear that they're going to get caught. But this was brought about by this scholar, Cesare Basiaria. And he believed that, again, in choosing their behavior, people act in their own best interest, meaning that they want to achieve pleasure and avoid pain, just like all of us do. And people will commit crime when that potential pleasure and reward they believe that they can achieve from illegal acts outweighs the threat of future punishment. So if you could commit a crime and you knew there was more, there wouldn't be a punishment for it, would you be more apt to do it? And this is part of the discussion that goes on under the umbrella of classical criminology. So ask yourself, look at this picture and say, how do you decide to rob? So if you wake up one day, or you're involved in criminal behavior or whatever, how do you make a decision to go out and rob? So, I mean, that should kind of make you sort of think a little bit. How do you do that? Is it fear of getting caught? Is it reputation if you get caught? Is it going to prison? I mean, all of these different things. So kind of to sum up the classical criminology thing, people have free will and will choose criminal or lawful solutions to meet their needs or to settle problems. And crime is attractive when it promises great benefits with little effort. and crime may be controlled by the fear of punishment, and punishment that is, or perceived to be, severe, certain, and swift, will deter criminal activity. And these are again from the writings of Bessarion as it relates to classical criminology. Now, during the 19th century, a new vision of the world, if you will, challenged the validity of this classical theory and presented a different innovative way of looking at the causes of crime. And the scientific method was beginning to take hold in Europe and North America, and an individual by the name of Auguste Comte, considered to be the founder of sociology, argued that societies pass through stages that can be grouped on the basis of how people try to understand the world in which they live. And this is considered positive criminology. This is the branch of social science that uses scientific methods of natural sciences and suggests that human behavior is, in fact, a product of social, biological, psychological, physiological, or economic forces. And that these forces can actually be empirically measured, so we can measure that. And what we will do with it is, or how we will do it will be through scientific methods that use some verifiable principles. So that's the positivist form of criminology. Now, later on, at the same time that the biological views were dominating criminology, another group of positivists, a little extension off there, were developing the field of sociology to study scientifically the major social changes taking place in 19th century society. And the foundations of sociological criminology can be traced to the work of Emile Durkheim. And this approach to criminology focused on the relationship between social factors and crime. Now, a little bit later, and we're gonna talk about Karl Marx now. In his Communist Manifesto and other described writings, Karl Marx, which we've heard of, described the oppressive labor conditions prevalent during the rise of the industrial capitalism. And Marx was convinced that the character of every civilization is determined by its mode of production, meaning the way its people develop and produce materials. And these writings from Marx laid the foundation for what is known as conflict theory. And this is the view that human behavior is shaped by interpersonal conflict, and that crime is a product of human conflict. And what emerged from this conflict theory finally is something called critical criminology. So critical criminology basically indicated that the economic system, as producing the conditions that support a high crime rate, meaning critical criminologists view that crime is a product of capitalism, and economics produced basically the conditions that supported that higher crime rate. So again, a lot of definitions, I know, but it's just an overview. So we're kind of throwing a lot at you right here. So now let's take a very quick look before we move on to our next kind of larger topic, some contemporary criminology over, let's say, the past 200 years. And we're just going to take a very, very quick at some of these, okay? So there's something called rational choice theory, and this argues that criminals are rational decision makers choosing to commit crime and evaluating the benefits and the cost. Their choice is structured by the fear of punishment. And then we have trait theory, the view that criminality is a product of abnormal biological or psychological traits. Also, there's a causal link between criminal behavior and factors like diet, or hormonal makeup, or personality, and even intelligence. We have the social structure theory, the view that disadvantaged economic class position is a primary cause of crime. We have the social process theory that says the view that criminality is a function of people's interactions with various organizations, institutions, and processes in society, basically modeling their behavior after somebody else. We have critical theory. Social and political conflict is the root cause of crime, and crime is related to the inherently unfair economic structure of the United States and other capitalist countries. And then we finally have developmental theory. And this is identifying the personal traits and social condition that lead to the creation of career criminals. And then I just throw this in for kind of a couple extra 2 cents here. You know, are criminals really born or are they made? And again, I put this chart in there for you that helps you because there's a lot of definitions, and you can see that each one of these perspectives or theories is there for you to take a look at. So we want to kind of move on so we can get done with this particular lecture. So let's talk now about deviant behavior. And it's, you know, what is deviance? And, you know, how do criminologists define crime? Well, criminologists, first of all, they devote themselves to measuring, understanding, and controlling crime and deviance. But how are these behaviors defined, and how do we distinguish between them? Well, criminologists view deviant behavior as any action that departs from the social norm of society. And deviance thus includes a broad spectrum of behavior ranging from the most socially harmful, things like rape and murder, to the relatively inoffensive stuff like joining a religious cult or cross-dressing. And a deviant act itself becomes a crime when it is deemed socially harmful or dangerous. It then will be specifically defined, prohibited, and punished under criminal law. Now, crime and deviance are often confused because not all crimes are deviant, and not all deviant acts are illegal or criminal. For example, recreational drug use, such as smoking marijuana, may be a crime, but is it deviant? A significant percentage of the population has used recreational drugs. And if an illegal act such as smoking pot or downloading copyrighted material becomes the norm, should society reevaluate its criminal status and let it become merely unusual or a deviant act? So when you kind of look at some of these, you start at the top, you can say, well, for sure, that's murder, rape, robbery. Those are like deviant or criminal. And then maybe graffiti, sure, that's a deviant act, if you will, you know, vandalism, abortion. I mean, depending upon your viewpoint, we're not going to argue that, you know, but what about tattoos or cross-dressing or picking your nose or cheating on a test? I mean, so that just shows you that, you know, it depends on your viewpoint on a lot of these different things. So again, deviant acts are criminalized when they become crimes, and deviant acts are decriminalized when penalties are reduced. And sometimes previously deviant acts are legalized and no longer considered crimes. And that's where you kind of look at marijuana. Now, we're not here for the marijuana debate, but at one point it was illegal both in the federal system and the state system. But now a lot of states are allowing and have passed laws where you can use marijuana recreationally, not just medically, and therefore it has become decriminalized. And I hope that kind of makes sense. And that's the rationale that they're talking about right here. And again, I have the same chart that I put in here where you can look at some of these different things. So let's move on to the last part of the lecture, and we're going to talk about the definition of a crime, and then we'll finish things up. So because of their diverse perspectives, criminologists have taken a variety of approaches in explaining crime's causes and suggesting methods for its control. Considering these differences, we can take elements from each school of thought to formulate kind of an integrated definition of crime. So crime is a violation of societal rules or behavior as interpreted and expressed by the criminal law, which reflects public opinion, traditional values, and the viewpoint of people currently holding social and political powers. Now, individuals who violate these rules are subject to sanctions by state authority or social stigma and even a loss of status. Now, no matter which definition of crime we tend to embrace, criminal behavior is tied to criminal law. It is therefore important for all criminologists to have some understanding of the development of criminal law, its objectives, its elements, and how it has evolved over time. Now, I put up here Penal Code 15 because this is the California Penal Code defines what a crime is. So you can read it. A crime or a public offense is an act committed or omitted, meaning you did it or you didn't do it, you failed to act, etc. In violation of law, forbidding or commanding it, meaning forbidding it, don't do it, commanding that you do it. And to which is annexed upon conviction, meaning if you get convicted, here's one of the things that can happen to you: death, imprisonment, fine, removal from office, or disqualification from office. That's the Penal Code definition of a crime. So the concept, though, of criminal law has been recognized for more than 3,000 years. And Hammurabi, which we're going to talk about the code of Hammurabi, if you will, the king of Babylon, created probably one of the most famous sets of written laws of the ancient world, known today as the Code of Hammurabi. Now, I have a link in there if you actually want to watch a little video on it. And it was preserved on basalt rock columns. And the code established a system of crime and punishment based on what we call physical retaliation, or lex talionis, or what is really kind of termed an eye for an eye. And this, again, was the first written criminal code developed in Babylonia, probably around 1750 BC. And more familiar, though, it would be the Mosaic Code of the Israelites, which included the Ten Commandments. And the Mosaic Code is not only the foundation of Judeo-Christian moral teachings, but also a basis for the U.S. legal system. Prohibitions against murder, theft, perjury, adultery, preceded by several thousand years the same laws found in modern United States. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Common law, the present system of law, can be traced back to the reign of Henry II, when royal judges began to publish their decisions in local cases, and their legal reasoning became what we call precedent. And this is a rule derived from previous judicial decisions that were applied in other cases, hence the term common law. And crimes such as murder, burglary, arson, and rape are common law crimes whose elements were initially defined by judges. and they were referred to as mala in se crimes, or inherently evil or depraved. And when the situation required, the English Parliament enacted legislation to supplement the common law shaped by judges, and crimes defined by Parliament, which reflected existing social conditions, were then referred to as what we call mala prohibitum crimes, or statutory crimes, crimes defined by statute. Now, in the US, and more specifically in California, all laws are statutory laws, which means that they are written, and they are typically contemporary criminal law. They divide things, the severity of them, if you will, into felonies, misdemeanors, and I didn't put it on there, but infractions. So, contemporary criminal law, what are some of the social goals? So, regardless of the classification, acts prohibited by the criminal law constitute behaviors considered unacceptable and impermissible by those in power. Now, people who engage in these acts are eligible for severe sanctions. By outlawing these behaviors, the government expects to achieve a number of social goals. And I've got a list of them here, and I'm just going to give you just a brief definition of each. So, one goal is to enforce social control. Another one is to discourage revenge. Another one is to express public opinion. Another one is to teach moral values. Another one, deter criminal behavior. Another one applies basically the punishment, the just deserts, meaning you get what you deserve. Another one creates equity. And then another one maintains the social order, because the legal system is designed to support and maintain the boundaries of the social system that we serve. So what about the kind of talking about the evolution of criminal law, just very, very quickly. The criminal law is constantly evolving in an effort to reflect social and economic conditions. And criminal law may also change because of shifts in culture and social conventions, thus reflecting a newfound tolerance for behavior that was condemned maybe only a few years ago. So we can look at three very quick areas. We have prisoner release. The U.S. is the #1 group, if you will, or people that put people in prison. And now we have a lot of prisoner release because of overcrowding and other things like that. So the question that we kind of ask ourselves, have things changed? Rape laws. In several states, including California and Maryland, the law has evolved so that the rape laws have changed to be more beneficial for the victim. And then even drug legalization, that has changed. A number of states have now legalized recreational use of marijuana, while others have legalized it for medical purposes. So, I mean, you can see how laws have changed. So let's bring it back around really quick to fact or fiction. The definitions of long-established common law crimes, rape, robbery, murder, never change. Well, even well-established criminal laws defining murder and rape are not set in stone, so they may change to reflect some current norms and values, the way that people think. So now let's finish up with the last two sections. We'll talk about the criminology and the criminal justice section. So not only is the study of criminology bound up in criminal law, it's also closely linked to the workings of the criminal justice system. And although the term criminology and criminal justice may seem similar, and people often confuse the two or lump them together, there are major differences between these fields of study. Criminology explains the origin, extent, and nature of crime in society, where criminal justice refers to the study of agencies of social control, like police, courts, and corrections. And while criminologists are mainly concerned with identifying the suspected cause of crime, the criminal justice scholars spend their time identifying effective methods to control crime. And the criminal justice system consists of the agencies of government that are charged with enforcing the law, like I talked about, adjudicating crime and correcting criminal conduct. It is essentially an instrument of social control. And society considers some behavior so dangerous and destructive that either strictly controls their occurrence or outlaws them outright. And the agencies of justice are assigned to prevent social harm by apprehend, trying, convicting, and punishing those who have already violated the law, as well as deterring those who may be contemplating wrongdoing. So let's finish up with the last part and talk about the ethical issues when it comes to criminology. What are some things that we really should study or even perhaps not study? So a critical issue facing criminology students involves recognizing the field's political and social consequences. And all too often, criminologists forget the social responsibility they bear as experts in the area of crime and justice. When government agencies request their views on issues, their pronouncements and opinions may become the basis for, again, sweeping changes in social policy. So a couple of the major ethical issues when we talk about issues on what to study and whom and how. What to study, criminologists must be concerned about the topics they study. Their research must not be directed by the sources of funding on which research projects really do rely on. The objectivity of research may be questioned if studies are funded by organizations that have a vested interest in the research. Now, whom to study, another ethical issue in criminology, concerns selection of research subjects. And too often, criminologists focus their attention on the poor and minorities while ignoring the middle-class white-collar crime, organized crime, and even government crime. And then how to study, the third area of concern, involves the methods used in conducting research. And one issue is whether subjects are fully informed about the purpose of this particular research. So that was a lot of information. We were able to get it done under 60 minutes. A couple of quick housekeeping things. Please take a look at the key terms and definitions that are posted in Canvas. These same key terms are also located at the end of each chapter, along with some critical thinking questions that will kind of get your juices flowing on some of the information that we talked about. So that's going to conclude our lecture 1, or our chapter 1 lecture. And until next time, have a great week.